Hi, everyone. Happy Women's History Month. I'm Professor Nadia Brown, and today you are here with us for a talk with Dr. Sami Schalk entitled Articulating and Enacting Black Disability Politics in the National Black Women's Health Project. And so we're going to give it a few minutes, not that long, but maybe like 2 or 3, just to let people funnel in that might be a little late to today's talk. So stand by and stay with us. Thank you again. All right, hi again. Welcome, welcome. I am so pleased to be able to moderate this talk by Dr. Sami Schalk entitled Articulating and Enacting Black Disability Politics in the National Black Women's Health Project. I'm Dr. Nadia Brown. I'm a professor in the government department and director of Women and Gender Studies program here at Georgetown University. Today's lecture is presented by the Women's and Gender Studies program, the Program in Disability Studies, the African American Studies Department, and the Gender Justice Initiative. A big thank you to my colleagues, Jennifer Fink, Robert Patterson, Melissa Heffeff, Libby Ratcliffe, as well as our wonderful administrative assistant, Leslie Byers, and for all of you who have worked to bring this program together. This event is presented in spoken English with ASL, interpretation and Zoom captions. Thanks to our interpreters, Vernice Williams and Rhonda Cunningham. Please make yourself comfortable, take bio breaks, do whatever you need to make this accessible to your particular body and mind. All of the disability studies events this semester will be hybrid or on Zoom, so that as a community, we can take what we learned about access during the pandemic and apply it, and not lose sight of those gains. So what we lack in liveliness, our conference breath, we will compensate for in our access to intimacy and enthusiasm. Georgetown University recognizes the land that we currently occupy was and still is the homeland of the Nakachuk Nation and their descendants, the Piscataway Kanoi people. Please take a moment, if you have not already done so, to Google whose land you are on, wherever you are. So let's turn this statement into a fact of a call to action, a call to restorative justice for the Nakatuck and Piscataway and all BIPOC people. I invite you to work with me on this. Here's the first step, and I'll post some links in the chat. For everyone to have access to. So I invite you to help us do the creative and crucial work of making a more and just equitable community here at Georgetown and in the world. I hope today's discussion with Professor Schalk will be one of those many reparative steps. So before we start, just some webinar rules. Keep in mind that you can ask questions to our speaker at any point using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We want to keep track of all our questions in one place. You can use the chat for comments, reactions, and always to show love. Thanks to those who ask questions upon registration, and we'll include those in the Q&A part. Again, special thank you to Vernice Williams and Rhonda Cunningham, and thank you for being with us. And they will take turns every 15 minutes or so. And next, to the main event, it is a tremendous honor and pleasure to introduce you to the brilliant Dr. Sami Schalk. She is an associate professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research focuses on disability, race, and gender in contemporary American culture. She's the author of Body Minds Reimagined, Disability, Race, Gender in Black Women's Speculative Fiction that was published by Duke University Press in 2018, and is the author of the forthcoming book, Black Disability Politics, also Duke University Press, due out in 2022. Schalk is a fat, Black, queer, disabled femme, a pleasure activist, a board member of Freedom Inc., a Black and Southwest Asian feminism activist and advocacy organization in Madison, Wisconsin. And so for that, I'll turn this over to Dr. Schalk to talk with us about her research.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you to everyone who helped organize this talk. Thank you to our interpreters. I am a light-skinned Black woman with short curly hair. I'm wearing a yellow shirt and red lipstick. There is a bookshelf behind me, as well as a bookshelf next to me. There may also at some point be a black cat wandering around the background, because that's how doing talks in your own house goes sometimes. So I am going to share my screen with some PowerPoint slides, but the slides are very basic. It's really just to reiterate some key information. So if it's helpful for you to look and follow along there, you're welcome to do that. But you can also just listen. There's nothing visual that you absolutely need to see on the slides. Okay, can we see this, or is my in the way? Slides are visible? Great, okay, let's get started. So my talk today comes from the second book project. Let's see, move that out of the way. My second book project, which is called Black Disability Politics. It'll be published by Duke University Press in the fall. It's looking like October at this point. The larger project analyzes how issues of disability, broadly construed, have been and continue to be incorporated into Black activism in the post-civil rights era, from the 1970s to the present. I define Black disability politics as anti-ableist arguments and actions performed by Black cultural workers which address disability within the context of anti-Black racism. Black disability politics are often performed in solidarity with disabled people writ large, but the articulation and enactment of Black disability politics does not necessarily center traditional disability rights language or approaches, such as disability identity and pride or civil rights inclusion. The book, therefore, seeks to analyze and identify examples of Black disability politics in order to correct the frequent overlooking and misrecognition that has typically occurred in scholarly evaluations of disability within Black activism. In addition to the work that I'll discuss tonight on the National Black Women's Health Project, the book also has 2 chapters on the Black Panther Party. These 2 organizations serve as my historical examples as I rely on existing scholarship and archival data, particularly the publications of these 2 groups, to develop my arguments. In addition, the final portion of the book, as well as 2 what we call praxis interludes that I wrote for the book, compare this work of the National Black Women's Health Project and the Black Panther Party with the work of contemporary Black disabled activists based on interviews that I performed in 2019. For the talk tonight, I will first briefly detail the central qualities of Black disability politics that I identify in the larger project. I will then provide general information about the National Black Women's Health Project before discussing more specifically how the project articulated and enacted Black disability politics in their Black feminist health activism. So, what are Black disability politics? First, again, I define disability politics generally as anti-ableist engagement with disability as a social and political rather than individual and medical concern. So therefore, Black disability politics are disability politics that are articulated in text, speech, political platforms, and ideologies, or enacted in activism, organizing, art, and interpersonal dynamics by Black cultural workers. The book analyzes the role of disability politics in the post-civil rights Black activism, exploring how Black cultural workers engage the intersections of and the relationship between Blackness and disability, or racism and ableism. My time period for this work spans the 1970s to the 2010s, focusing on Black disability politics articulated and enacted alongside or in the wake of the contemporary disability rights movement. In analyzing the work of the Panthers, the National Black Women's Health Project, and the contemporary Black disabled activists, such as the Harriet Tubman Collective, I've identified 4 common qualities of Black disability politics. By identifying these qualities, I aim to provide a framework for interpreting the articulations and enactments of Black disability politics, one that accounts for the distinct ways that Black people have experienced, engaged with, and encountered the disability system. My hope is that my identification and analysis of the major qualities of Black disability politics in the book will prove useful to scholars researching engagement with disability within Black cultural sites of analysis, and may be adaptable in form, if not substance, to study how other racialized populations have articulated and enacted their own form of disability politics. So I argue that when Black cultural workers engage with disability, their approaches and perspectives tend to be 1, intersectional but race-centered, 2, not necessarily based in disability identity or pride, 3, contextualized and historicized, and 4, holistic and broad. And I'm going to explain each of these briefly. So by intersectional but race-centered, I mean that Black disability politics always considers the relationship between multiple systems of oppression, but often race is the central or motivating analytic rather than disability. By not necessarily based in disability identity or pride, I mean that unlike the mainstream disability rights movement, Black disability political work does not rely on a person claiming a disability identity or espousing disability pride. And in fact, much Black disability politics are performed by Black people who would not refer to themselves as disabled. By contextualized and historicized, I mean that because many Black people are disabled by secondary health effects of disease, environmental racism, racial violence, and state neglect, Black disability politics are often articulated and enacted with critical attention to the historical circumstances, events, and legacies which have shaped experiences of disability within Black communities. Lastly, by holistic and broad, I mean first, that the work of Black disability politics tends to address body-minds holistically, not predominantly focused on physical and sensory disabilities, as disability studies and disability activism have been historically. This holistic approach consistently includes health, illness, disease, and psychological well-being. I also use holistic and broad to describe how Black disability political work tends to attempt social and political change at the micro, individual and community, and the macro, societal, national, and international levels. Holistic and broad, therefore, both refers to the topic or content of Black disability politics, as well as the methods and the tactics of that work. So now that I've explained the overarching goals of the larger project, including these central qualities of Black disability politics, I'll now provide an overview of the National Black Women's Health Project, then explain how the organization articulated and enacted Black disability politics within their Black feminist health activism. The National Black Women's Health Project was started in 1981 as a project within the National Women's Health Network to focus on the specific health needs of Black women. It was incorporated into an independent nonprofit organization in 1984 with its base in Atlanta, Georgia. Early organizational documents defined the National Black Women's Health Project as, quote, a health education, advocacy, and empowerment project designed and directed by Black women to critically examine the healthcare concerns and issues permanent to the lives of all Black women and their families. The project sees its mission as empowering Black women to take an active part in the decisions that govern their lives and teaches us to seek affirmation, validation, and support within ourselves first, then within the network of our sisters. Only through an analysis of the forces that have shaped our lives as Black women, through the telling of our life stories, does the National Women's Health Project believe that we can, end quote. From its inception, the National Black Women's Health Project promoted an intersectional and specifically Black feminist approach to addressing health disparities and health crises for Black women, with an aim to improve health across Black communities in general. The National Black Women's Health Project activities ranged from major national conferences on Black women's health, Black Women's Leadership Institutes, the Walking for Wellness program to encourage more physical activity, and the Plain Talk program to create dialogue about sex and sexuality between Black mothers and daughters. The project also produced policy briefs, sponsored and published research, and developed programming on HIV/AIDS, diabetes, hypertension, and substance abuse in the Black community. From 1988 to 1996, the project also operated the Center for Black Women's Wellness in Atlanta, a wellness center and clinic in a public housing neighborhood, which provided free health screenings, vocational training, self-help groups, and more. The National Black Women's Health Project also published Vital Signs, the organization's official newsletter, and two self-help books for Black women. Self-help as a philosophy and a practice was for many years the core program of the National Black Women's Health Project. The project fostered the development of self-help support groups across the country, which were intended to provide supportive environments for Black women, teens, and girls to tell their stories, address their health concerns, learn about and combat internalized oppression, and connect with other Black women. The self-help groups range from 3 to 10 women who would meet on a regular, typically weekly basis for 2 to 3 hours. The project's self-help groups sometimes formed around specific health issues, but more often they were based in existing social networks, meeting in women's homes, in community centers, or churches. The groups were led and organized by co-developers who received direct training and regular leadership development 3 times a year from the organization. The philosophy undergirding the creation and maintenance of these groups was explicitly political and praxis focused, as they combined historical and political education with public health education in a non-medical, explicitly Black and women-centered setting. The self-help groups were intended to form the foundation for women to take action regarding their health and the health of others in their communities. As one self-help group meeting guide explains, quote, the goal is to develop a sense of empowerment and activism to take actions. The self-help group is not the action or organizing group, but is the place where women develop a greater sense of capacity to be able to make change, close quote. The project, therefore, envisions self-help groups as a means to impact Black women and Black community health at the micro and macro levels. The self-help philosophy of the National Black Women's Health Project, which undergirded most of their work for over a decade, can be interpreted within a Black disability political framework in multiple ways. For instance, while the self-help groups were occasionally formed around specific disabilities or diseases, such as diabetes, the groups were not disability identity based nor segregated by disability or health status, instead strongly encouraging women with and without disabilities and diseases to participate and understand their body minds as impacted by history and politics of race, gender, class, and sexuality. As a Center for Black Women's Wellness funding proposal to the Kellogg Foundation states, quote, self-help groups do not stigmatize their members because of health or social conditions. They may therefore have as members women who are single parents, chronic disease sufferers, homeless persons, and women of varied educational backgrounds, health challenges, and ages, end quote. The project's self-help groups moved away from a strictly medical model of disability, health, and disease by emphasizing the need to address internalized oppression and have a broad network of emotional and material support. Organizational materials repeatedly made clear that self-help groups were not therapy, not because therapy was bad or to be avoided, but because therapy typically involves an expert and a recipient of that expertise. As one self-help manual for co-developers states, quote, no one person is the expert. It is a relationship between peers/equals. All the members of the group use the expertise gained from their lives to help self and help each other. No one pays or gets paid. No medical tools are used. The goal is wellness, not elimination of symptoms. Professional therapy may be used in conjunction with self-help to augment and accelerate the healing process, close quote. As this quote suggests, the National Black Women's Health Project fully embraced the need for quality medical care, including psychotherapy, while simultaneously believing that providing access to and improving the quality of medical care alone was not enough to fully address the legacies of racism and sexism which shape Black women's experience of disability, health, and disease. As the project grew, becoming increasingly reliant on major federal and foundation funding and putting more efforts into policy briefs, lobbying, and research, self-help became far less central to the work. By the turn of the century, self-help groups were mentioned less and less in the organizational materials until disappearing entirely. In 2002, the organization officially still exists under today. This name change was long overdue, marking not only the organization's move away from the self-help philosophy upon which it was founded, but also other major organizational shifts that had been slowly occurring since 1996, when founder Billie Avery, Bylleavery, ceased her central leadership of the project, and the organization relocated its headquarters to Washington, D.C. So as a result of these major shifts that occurred between 1996 and 2002, for the purpose of my work, I focus on the work of the project in the 1980s and the 1990s only. And I do that because it really did become a very different organization. The National Women's Health Project's approach to defining and addressing health was much different than typical public health organizations. Project materials typically defined health as, quote, not merely the absence of illness, but the active promotion of physical, spiritual, mental, and emotional wellness of this and future generations. This definition of health draws largely from the World Health Organization's definition, first published in 1948, which, quote, defines health positively as complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely negatively as the absence of disease or infirmity, close quote. There are, however, a few key differences between these two definitions, which you have on the screen. First, the project's definition drops mention of infirmity, which suggests the inclusion of the elderly and or the disabled within states of health. Second, the project's definition includes spiritual and emotional wellness in an attempt to account for the role of spirituality in the lives of Black women, as well as the need to tend to emotional well-being. The terms emotional and mental are used in different ways over the course of the organization's history. Sometimes both appear in the ways they talk about health, and sometimes one or the other. But at least one of these terms, mental or emotional health, is always included alongside spiritual and physical well-being. Lastly, the project's definition of health emphasizes action in the, quote, active promotion of wellness, and the need to think communally and long-term in the phrase this and future generations. These slight differences between the National Black Women's Health Project and the World Health Organization's definitions of health, we can begin feminist public health organization differed ideologically from more general public health organizations. In their work, the project articulated and enacted Black disability politics, refusing to stigmatize or shame Black women for their health statuses and promoting wellness for all, including disabled people. The National Black Women's Health Project approached health in holistic, culturally attuned, and politicized ways. In each of these three overlapping approaches, we can further understand the organization's articulation and enactment of Black disability politics. And again, this is a brief version of a chapter from the book, so all of these are talked at length in the book. As the above discussed definition of health suggests, the National Black Women's Health Project took a holistic and broad approach to health, which included physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. The project believed that one could not address physical symptoms and concerns without also addressing and caring for the mental, emotional, and spiritual elements of a person, which would equip them with the knowledge, support, materials, skills, and confidence to attend to their physical health. This holistic approach meant that although the project addressed a wide variety of health and wellness topics in their programming and publications, from physical concerns like heart disease, cancer, HIV/AIDS, and environmental health hazards, to more physical and spiritual ones like self-love, sexual relationships, domestic violence, and incest. The wide variety of illnesses, disease, conditions, and disabilities that the project addressed in their work is typical of much Black health activism generally and Black disability politics specifically, which tends to be more broad and inclusive of disability, but not primarily focused on it. This broadness is particularly reflective of the reality that Black people are more likely to be disabled by secondary health effects of otherwise non-disabling and or preventable illnesses due to lack of educational, social, and financial access to preventative care and early treatment, as well as medical racism. The project understood the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of health as overlapping and mutually dependent. That is, one's mental and emotional well-being could impact physical and spiritual well-being and vice versa. This is evident, for example, in a 1986 Vital Signs article titled Emotional Aspects of Chronic Illness, which begins with the statement, quote, emotional aspects of chronic illnesses are real and often long-lasting, close quote. Then the article goes on to provide examples of how chronic illness emotionally impacts people, such as grief or shame produced by the loss of ability to work, changes in self-esteem due to changes in physical appearance, and feelings of being objectified and denied privacy within the medical industrial complex. Here and in other articles and publications, it's clear that the project understood and promoted a holistic version of health that was dynamic and interconnected. Importantly, unlike most holistic approaches to health, which tend to understand whole body minds as including the physical and mental emotional, the National Black Women's Health Project also explicitly included the spiritual in their conceptualization of holistic health. The inclusion of Women's Health Project's work is an example of their cultural approach to health. The project's approach to health was influenced by African diasporic cultures and rooted in the lived experiences of Black women. This cultural aspect of the project's approach to health is emblematic of the contextualized and historicized approach to disability that is typical of Black disability politics. At its core, the National Black Women's Health Project believed in the need for health initiatives created for us, by us. This culturally contextualized approach to health is represented in their inclusion of spirituality and their promotion of culturally informed public health initiatives. The project recognized the need to include spiritual health within Black feminist health activism in order to reach their intended audience. Spirituality is not a common element of disability studies or public health work typically. Disability studies scholars have engaged with religion primarily through discussions of ableism in Christian churches, critiques of faith healing, and challenges to the idea that disability is either a gift or a curse from God. And yet, spirituality, faith, and religion are major parts of Black culture and therefore critical to interpreting Black disability politics. While many Black people identify as Christian, and the National Black Women's Health Project often partnered with Black Christian churches as locations for programming, it's important that the project's cultural approach to health conceived of spirituality much more expansively, often explicitly discussing African and Caribbean spiritual practices as well. Disability studies scholar Julie Avril-Minnick, and Julie, then Avrilminich, discusses the importance of cultural healing practices such as those which occur in the Botanica and Latinx communities, which supplement or provide alternatives to medical and social systems which have failed, excluded, or harmed marginalized people. The Botanica is typically a small store which sells herbal medicines, oils, and teas, as well as religious candles, crystals, incense, and other products for spiritual, magical, or ancestral practices. Similar types of alternative healing practices are represented in vital signs, often with discussion of the history of these practices within Black diasporic cultures. Minnick argues that a disability studies perspective can help us interpret representations of and engagement with alternative healing practices among low-income and racialized communities as both evidence of the need for an improved healthcare system and as an indication of how, quote, bodily difference can have diverse social and cultural meanings, close quote. And that quote's from Minnick. Although the ableism of some religious, spiritual, and alternative healing practices is undeniable and worthy of critique, critical race disability studies scholars must balance this attention and this critique with attention to racism and classism, which shapes our interpretation of what spiritual and healing practices are deemed acceptable, while also exploring what these practices actually mean to disabled people of color. The National Black Women's Health Project's cultural approach to health demonstrates the value of leaving space for spiritual and alternative healing practices within Black feminist health activism and Black disability politics. A second aspect of the project's cultural approach to health is the promotion and creation of culturally based public health initiatives. The project was critical of public health programs developed for communities by people outside of those communities. They instead promoted and created programming which met people where they were and took a community's own desires and needs into account. The organization was explicit and insistent about the need for public health officials and researchers to learn about, honor, and incorporate cultural perspectives and values into the development and implementation of programming. Because, they argued, public health initiatives which do not account for the lived realities, priorities, and desires of their targeted population are destined to fail. This insistence is evident, for example, in a funding proposal for the Project Center for Black Women's Wellness, which states, quote, "We respect the opinions and recognize the dignity and the personal resources of the persons in this population." And this population here is referring to Black women in the Atlanta area. "We recognize that the people most affected by a problem and who live with it daily often carry the solutions within themselves. Health educators, medical providers, and service program planners can benefit greatly from the involvement of people as active participants in their own healthcare, rather than as passive recipients of services. Indeed, the success of these services depends on the acceptance and active involvement of the people expected to benefit from them." End quote. Here, the organization makes clear that their work will center the recipients of health education and healthcare programs. The project's tactic for culturally based public health initiatives therefore involved asking Black women what they want and need to attend to their health, rather than telling them what to do or developing programs without regard to how these programs will be interpreted and experienced by populations supposedly being helped. Overall, the National Black Women's Health Project's cultural approach to health, which included spirituality and culturally based public health initiatives, is an example of how Black cultural workers articulate Black disability politics in very contextualized ways that account for how race, gender, class, and culture intersect with experiences of disability, health, and disease. This cultural approach to health, which builds upon and overlaps with the project's holistic approach to health, also necessitated engagement with broader politics. Politics, if it was not already very clear, were consistently at the center of the National Black Women's Health Project's work at all levels. In a meeting guide for self-help groups, the organization asserts, quote, "Our commitment to health includes understanding the umbrella of oppression that hovers over us and the reality for all Black women of the pervasiveness of oppressive conditions in our lives. By better understanding the ways in which these interlocking oppressions affect health status, we can look at our wellness within the broader social/political/economic context that is our reality. In this way, our efforts to promote our health are clearly political in nature as we take control of our lives and support each other to do the same." Close quote. The National Black Women's Health Project, as is apparent in this quote, positioned health as a political issue. That is, as something that is both experienced within larger contexts of oppression and directly impacted by political policy. But in this section of my talk, in discussing their political approach to health, I'll focus on how the organization encouraged raised political consciousness and political engagement among their membership. In the larger chapter, I discuss how the project historicized Black women's health and centered Black women's stories in their publications. But for the purposes of time, I'm just going to focus on political education and empowerment. The National Black Women's Health Project's political approach to health included patients' rights education, policy briefs, and training for political engagement through leadership institutes. This work demonstrates a commitment to both micro and macro level change and an understanding of how progress at one level necessitates and encourages continued progress in the other. In the organization's own words, quote, The National Black Women's Health Project works at the primary prevention level with individuals and groups, at the community action level, where groups influence local health policies which affect them, and at the national policy level, where the perspectives of African American women influence policymakers and the public, close quote. The project believed the adage that knowledge is power, but they also asserted that knowledge without the empowerment, means, and skills to use that knowledge is of little value to multiply marginalized people. One way the project sought to empower Black women with knowledge and skills was via patients' rights education. The organization believed in the need to be knowledgeable about one's own body, mind, as well as one's rights within the medical industrial complex. In the organization's health book, Body and Soul, chapter 19, is titled Dealing with Doctors and Hospitals. And this chapter enacts this combination of patients' education, patients' rights education, and empowerment. The chapter provides questions on what to ask when choosing a new doctor, advice on how to prepare for a doctor's appointment, information on what to ask, expect, and do during a doctor's visit, a descriptive list of medical specialists that one might encounter in a hospital, and an example of a patient's Bill of Rights from a Brooklyn hospital. Similarly, the project published vital signs articles in 1993 and 1994, which specifically detailed how Black women with HIV/AIDS could qualify for Social Security disability benefits with instructions on how to apply. By publishing this kind of information, the National Black Women's Health Project taught Black women how to advocate for themselves and their loved ones within the medical industrial complex. In addition to the more individual, micro-level political education and empowerment of patients' rights education, the project also sought to use a political approach to health to enact more macro-level change via policy briefs and training for political engagement. By encouraging Black women to be aware of planned policies which would impact their health and teaching them how to respond to and impact local and national politics, the National Black Women's Health Project not only supported Black women's politicized awareness of health, but also provided tools to take action. The majority of this formal legislative and lobbying work occurred in the 1990s after the establishment of the project's Public Policy and Public Education Office in Washington, D.C. From 1991 to 1999, the National Black Women's Health Project regularly published a vital signs section, and Vital Signs again is their newsletter, called Public Education and Policy. This section contained position statements, policy briefs, and legislative updates on healthcare reform, abortion rights, birth control, welfare reform, family and medical leave, and sexual and domestic violence legislation. The National Black Women's Health Project did not simply provide this information to membership, but also encourage members to do something in response to local, state, and federal policies impacting their health by also publicizing political action events such as marches, demonstrations, and days of solidarity. They also created more formal institutes and trainings to develop individual Black women's activist skills. For example, the project's 1993 conference included one workshop on public policy aimed to teach attendees, quote, how to become an active participant in health advocacy at the local, national, and global level, talk to national and international leaders about politicizing Black women's health agendas, close quote. The same conference also included another workshop for general leadership training, which sought to show participants, quote, how to become an effective leader in your community through grassroots organizing, networking, and coalition building, close quote. These multiple leadership development opportunities, combined with the health, patients' rights, and policy education provided through the project publications, sought to ensure that Black women had the information, confidence, skills, and support to enact change in their local communities, as well as at the state and national levels if they desired. Together, Together, the holistic, cultural, and political approaches to health shape the way that the National Black Women's Health Project articulated and enacted their particular form of Black disability politics. The individual aspects of each of these three approaches illustrate all of the common qualities of Black disability politics generally that I develop in the book. The project's approaches to health were holistic and broad, intersectional but race, and in this case also gender centered, not based in disability identity or pride, historicized and contextualized, and aimed at creating both micro and macro level change. Understanding the history of the organization and its self-help philosophy, overall mission, and holistic cultural and political approaches to health allows us to trace how the National Black Women's Health Project engaged with issues of disability in more and less explicit ways, but always in political ways. There are several important lessons to be drawn from the Black disability politics of the National Black Women's Health Project. Most importantly, perhaps, the project's work demonstrates how Black health activism can be inclusive of disability politics, even as the work may emphasize concepts of health, wellness, and healing that are typically considered antithetical to disability inclusion and acceptance. Indeed, it's critical that scholars take a culturally contextualized approach to analyzing health activism and engagement with alternative healing practices, including spiritual ones, within racialized, poor, and otherwise marginalized communities, in order to understand the place of disability and disabled people within this work. My aim here has been to highlight the varied ways that National Black Women's Health Project's publications, programming, and overall Black feminist health philosophy in order to frame the organization as one clearly engaged in Black disability politics. Thank you all for your time, and I believe we have time and space for questions.
Right. Thank you, Professor Schalk. This was so enlightening. And there's a really wonderful message in the chat that says, from Billy Abdullah, who says, you spoke a little, oh, no, I'm sorry. First off, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking tonight. I've never seen such an inclusive and accessible presentation. So want to make sure you heard that and saw that. As a reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen here. I see one question is in the chat now, so I will ask that, but as I'm asking that, Professor Schalk is responding, please put your questions in the chat so we can start a lively dialogue and conversation tonight. So this question says, we spoke a little bit about patient rights education as a political approach to health. What kind of policies inside institutions are helpful when advocating for the education of patient rights in a clinical setting?
So the policies that, there weren't really policies within the organization. I mean, what they did was get that information out there and seek it. So I think less about policies within organizations, if we're talking about like a public health organization, and more about how do you gather that information and get it out there, because a lot of folks don't know their rights. They don't know what to expect. And I mean, even as I was doing this research, I learned things that were important to me. And I really thought that in the book where they make this list of like, this is what an anesthesiologist is, this is what this part, like, here's all the people that you might interact with. I think that's really important. Even the fact that the Patients' Rights Education Guide said, you know, most hospitals have a patient advocate, that you can ask for this person. This is not information that a lot of people know, especially if folks have not had extended engagement. You know, they might get it in paperwork that they might not read. So how does this information get out in accessible ways to the people who need it most, who need the most advocacy support when they're in these kind of situations? So that's what I think. It's less about policy, it's and more about how do we get that education out there and available to people. And of course, they were putting this out in books at the time. Of course, now this could be like on the internet. But I think that's really what it is how do we teach folks who are going to be more likely to be like intimidated or kind of bulldozed over in these situations, to know what their rights are, to know what to expect. Because if you don't know how you should be treated, you don't
Right.
know when you are not being treated the way you should be treated. Yeah.
Right. No, thank you. We have 4 questions in the chat now, so thank you all for participating, coming with great questions. One question asks you to talk a little bit about how you did the research, and what you found in your research. The question is, you've mentioned a funding application to the Kellogg Foundation and other similar materials. I'd love to hear more about your archival materials that you've used and that you put together in the book on the MBWHP and challenges therein. Any archival
Yeah.
surprises?
Yeah, so all of their archive is at the Sophia Smith collection, so at Smith College. So that's where their archives are, and I went there, spent 2 weeks just going through the materials, and it's a lot of things. It's a lot of their publications and notes. It's a lot of funding applications, because you know how it works when you're funding something, lots and lots of applications, as well as documentation from the various self-help groups that folks would send in. And those really varied. Sometimes it would be like 4 women came, it was good, and that's the report. And sometimes it was more detailed. So yeah, really, really variable. And, I did notice, I quote several things from, Kellogg Foundation and other kind of major grants. That really did change a lot for the organization as they sought bigger and bigger grants and partnerships. It kind of forced them into shifting away from the more grassroots stuff that they were doing at the beginning in terms of the self-help groups. And that's largely because, and this is just something that I like to say, just because those of us who do research, right, that when you get this kind of funding, you're supposed to show impact. And it's really hard to show impact from a group of Black women who sit around together and speak confidentially to one another.
Mm.
How are you supposed to do that? So unless you are like very meticulously making these women like do surveys all the time, it would be a very different kind of thing. And so because it was so hard to show the impact, that to get the kind of funding, to get more funding support, they had to shift the way that they were working. So that's why there was a shift to more of these kind of programs where they could say, okay, the Walking for Wellness program, we had 97 women show up and walk 3 miles together, and they could kind of it's easier to show those numbers. And so that was, I don't know if I would call it like a surprise in the archive, but it was a thing that I was like, of course that this is why, the way that we have access to funding to support the work is going to shape the kind of work we can do if it's dependent on this, like show the impact, show the change in this particular kind of way that they had a much harder time doing with the self-help groups. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Another question asks, have you interacted with Native American or Latinx groups? I'm wondering if perhaps this question might mean, have you seen any kind of similarities in other groups that are doing work in this area?
Yeah, so I haven't done research on other groups, and I kind of say it at the beginning of the talk, and I also say it in the book that like I would love for other folks to do this kind of research in other racialized communities, because I think it's manifesting within Black communities is the same for other folks, right? Because our history shaped the way that we experience disability. But for the National Black Women's Health Project, they were the first from the National Women's Health Network to kind of break away and form their own specific organization. And then an Asian American women's group, and so like all these other groups also existed. So those are out there to research and to see, like, were they also engaged? Like, those organizations exist. I feel like this book and this project is very much me being like, please do more of this research. Like, please, someone else come do this, because there's so much, and there's just so little that is really thinking about disability from the perspective of racialized communities,
Mhm.
that isn't just automatically bringing the existing definitions and understandings of disability from more white and mainstream organizations. So as I said, National Black Women's Health Project and the Black Panthers are my two organizations that I talk about, and neither of them understand themselves as disability organizations. Like, that's not the way that they understand themselves, the way that other people understand them, but the work was still very much this disability politic informed by an anti-racist politic. So I think it's really important for us to go into these spaces where we see disability and health being talked about or addressed, and go in without assumptions and just see like what is actually happening here. And that's kind of how I stumbled into this work. Was I originally was looking at the Black Panther Party's work on sickle cell anemia, and then found all this other stuff, and it just like led me down a whole other archival path that now I have a whole book about.
Oh, and that's fascinating, right? The story of the, what you thought you were researching or what you had planned to, and then the data, and obviously your own passions lead you in a different direction. And I'm also really thankful that you share. This is a call to action, right? That this is what your book is about, and there is so much more that can be done. And so hopefully those that are on this webinar tonight hear this and perhaps pick up this mantle and do, start researching in their own communities or in other communities in this way that Dr. Schalk is doing. Another question asks about the impact of the geographical location, right? So when the MBWHP moved in Atlanta to DC, how did that impact or change the policies and goals of the organization?
Yeah, so the geographic move was really because of this shift to doing more policy work, more major foundation work. And so they were able to kind of have those relationships. So there were a couple years where they were still based in Atlanta, but had a DC office, and then eventually just fully shifted to DC. So I think the geographic shift is also about the shift in the focus and the kind of work that they were doing, which ended up being, a much more macro focused in the end, and then focus on these more grassroots efforts. So the geographic change is, a reflection of that shift in focus of the kind of work. And when I talk about the shift, I want to make clear that I think work on these levels is all important. It's not like I'm saying it's now a bad organization. It's just a very different organization. And so just in terms of being able to do the work realistically, I was going to focus on the work prior to that shift. But like I said, the organization still exists now, National Black Women's Health Imperative. You can find them online and see the kind of work that they're doing now. And you can still see the way that it's deeply connected to the work that they were doing in the 80s and 90s.
Thank you. Another question, panel participant thanks you for your presentation and asks you to make some connections. So you briefly addressed the NWBHP, sexuality and holistic health. The question is, are you finding anything related to cognitive disability, sexuality, and Blackness? This participant is thinking something like Crip Camp Doc that briefly shows this in the Black Panther Party. And what archives are you using for sexuality and Black disability politics?
So not a lot on cognitive disability, a lot on psych disability, particularly the National Black Women's Health Project dealing a lot with trauma. So there's a lot of work on dealing with sexual trauma and thinking about that. And again, they weren't necessarily using the label of psychiatric disability, but very much talking about Black women and Black girls trauma around sexual violence. And so that's where it shows up most strongly in the archives, in terms of just how those things are connected. And this was particularly an important issue for them when they were developing some of their program Plain Talk, which was about conversations between Black mothers and daughters. And some of the things that they write about is like, you can't just tell people use a condom. If people are dealing with like violence in the home, that like if they were to suggest that to a partner, there may be violence, there may be like, there's all these other things that you can't just simplistically say use protection, and if you don't, it's your fault. And so that they started to realize like that they needed to have these other conversations about healthy relationships and things like that to even then get to the point to talk about safe sex, because safe sex did not seem to be on the table when they actually talked to Black women that were like, he's mad when I like don't do dinner right. Like, you think I'm going to ask him for that to do that? Like, that's not going to happen. And so that's where you see sexuality the most in there. It doesn't really show up so much in the Black Panthers work, but they do. So at Crip Camp, the documentary talks about the 504 sit-in, which the Black Panthers were deeply involved in. And that's the first chapter of the book is all about the 504 sit-in. So if y'all are interested in that, you can read about it in the book. And I didn't mention this at the beginning. This is the first talk I've given in a while, but the book is going to be published open access. So it will be publicly available on the internet. So you do not have to pay for it if you don't want to pay for it. If you want to buy a copy of the book, that's great. Duke would love that, but you don't have to. You don't have to buy it. It will be publicly available because I want people to read it and to use it. And it just is an important thing for me. So I worked with Duke to make that happen.
That's amazing. If I be offline, I like to ask you questions like, how did you do that? And just, yeah.
Money, basically money is how I did that.
Basic answer, money. Okay. So back to our regularly scheduled program with some questions from the participants. Someone else asked to hear your thoughts regarding fat rights in these discussions. We have important like anti-bullying bills, like Safe Schools Improvement Act of 2001, that doesn't include fat people, for example. Do you want to address kind of how some people are not talked about, or what you found in your own research?
Yeah. So again, fatness does not show up explicitly, although I definitely think that fatness falls within disability in the sense that it is hyper-medicalized, right? Like people talk about this obesity epidemic, so it's clearly put under this like disability umbrella in our social culture, which means that fat folks experience ableism. But the way that fatness shows up is actually in this very early narrative from Billie Avery, the founder of National Black Women's Health Project, where she talks about this moment that was her click moment of how she had to change her approach to public health work. So she was doing these like meetings with Black women talking about nutrition and aimed at weight loss, right? To address like weight in Black communities. And she said, she did these sessions and she would go through and be like, okay, here's how to count calories and here's how to here's some recipes you could use. And she essentially had these like Black women look at her and be like, yeah, we know this. It's not that we don't know this information. It's that I don't have the time, I don't have the money, I don't have the energy, my kids refuse to eat it, all these other things. And it's not about that. And so Billie Avery talks about this as being this like aha moment that she was like, oh, the knowledge isn't enough. And the assumption that we keep making as public health folks that they just don't know. We just got to tell them. It's like, no, they know.
Right.
The circumstances of their lives make it so that implementing that knowledge is difficult to impossible. And so that became, do this now. How do we do this differently for Black women that attends to these specific needs and issues that they're dealing with? And so that's this place where she's like talking to these fat Black women that are like, yeah, we know how to count. We know how many calories you're supposed to have. We've seen all this information. That is actually not the problem for me. And so taking that, again, like broader contextual approach to understanding fatness was a real impetus moment for her. So that's a place where it shows up, but it doesn't show up often in the archives at all, yeah.
Another question from a participant asks you to parse out the term wellness versus the expression of elimination of symptoms. What do you see as the implications for each of these terms?
Yeah, so the way that they talk about wellness is really individualized, which is something that I really like about it, right? Because what wellness means for me as a Black disabled person might be different than for a non-disabled person, a person who has a different kind of disability, right? A good day for me might still look very different than a good day for somebody else. And so that's something that you see in the work. So that's the difference, right? That wellness might mean you're still having symptoms. It's not about an elimination of symptoms, or what in disability studies might say a cure. It's not about a cure. It's not about eliminating or being non-disabled, but it's about being well within the bodies that we have, the body minds that we have, which means, we take care of ourselves, we do things, but that doesn't mean that now at the end of the day, we're all able-bodied and able-minded afterwards. And that's what I really appreciate about their work, and what I found, fascinating about this public health work, that it really did acknowledge that we're like taking people from the place that they are at and not blaming them, recognizing that all of our health issues as Black folks are shaped by the world that we live in, the oppression that we experience, the way that we are treated in medical spaces, the access that we have to information in medical spaces, all of that. And so to say, yeah, we might not all be able-bodied, but we can be well. And that is a goal that we can achieve through all of these things by not just focusing on physical, but also thinking about our spiritual and our mental well-being as well. So that's that distinction that they make. And I do in the chapter talk a little bit more about how wellness is more individualized in their work.
Thank you. I think that's an important distinction. And thank you for walking us through that.
Yeah.
Another question asks about the role of the internet and social media as kind of taking over how organizations can disseminate information. But we recognize that some people are left out of internet access and don't have access to this kind of information. I know that this is not the time period in which you are doing your research for this book, but can you talk a little bit about how organizations are trying to meet this gap, right, of trying to disseminate information using social media or the internet, and those that might be left behind because of the digital divide?
Yeah. So I don't know how organizations like specifically are doing this work, but I can think about and I can name some of the ways that the National Black Women's Health Project was trying to specifically reach Black folks, right? So one of the things that they did was they would hold programming and events in Black churches. They would partner with Black churches. They would take the programming to people, to community centers. And one of my favorite ones that they did work, which is the fourth chapter. So the chapter that I shared from today is the third. The fourth chapter focuses on their HIV and AIDS prevention work. And one of the programs that they developed was HIV/AIDS prevention education, that they specifically reached out to and worked with hairdressers and barbers, so that they educated hairdressers and barbers and then gave them pamphlets and brochures to put in their shops. And that's one of the ways that they tried to do community specific, culturally specific education work, because they were doing this work at a time that people really genuinely believed that you could only get HIV if you were a gay man. And the numbers were already going up for Black women. And so they were trying to figure out how to get like the very basic information of like, you're at risk, you should get tested here, all of these things out there in locations that would make sense. So a lot of public health work was focusing on like bars and club spaces, and often still does. And that was not going to reach the Black women that this organization was trying to reach, right? So that's an example of like, where are the people that you're trying to get to? So if you're thinking about folks who don't have access to the internet, is that because they're in rural spaces? So then where in these rural spaces can you go that is a gathering place or a central location? Is it because of money access? Then how can you get to like public places like libraries, like where are the people? Go to where the people are is really like the lesson that I would take from their work. And connecting with leaders. So that was the other thing, connecting with the barbers and the hairstylists,
Mhm.
connecting with church leaders, people that the folks in community actually listen to and believe. So educating the folks who are influential in their communities is another way of getting information out outside of social media and internet. Yeah.
Thanks. Another participant asks, in thinking about the role of broadly understood spirituality within self-help circles, how are these non-medical practices of healing discussed? Can you elaborate more on the intersection of spiritual healing practices and self-help groups?
Yeah. So I don't I can't say exactly how they were talked about within the groups, right? Because they were confidential groups. So there are like, report backs, but not like specifically what people said. But I can talk about what was published in the newsletter. And the newsletter often included stories and reflections from women who were in these groups. And so some of this was stuff like my church prayer group got me through a hard time. Like they were the ones that showed up to me. So some of it was about like religious communities. Some of it is about really believing that prayer was a significant part of how they got through a particular kind of illness or yeah. So this aspect of the book it's in there, and I say it in the book too, that it was really hard for me to do as someone who has like my own kind of religious trauma. When this stuff started showing up in the archive, I was like, I don't know what to do with this. And
Mhm.
so this is another one of those places in the work that I'm just like, please, other people who do more work in spirituality and religion, explore the way that disabled
Right.
people are people of faith. Because so in the contemporary interviews that I did, there's a Black disabled activist, T Banks, Banks, who talked about when he was first diagnosed and going through understanding his psych disability. He was going to use medication and he was going to use therapy, and he had people in his church space say, you don't need therapy, you need God. You don't need medicine, you need prayer. And his response, and the quote that I put in the book, which I might get a little bit off, but he said something to the effect of like, it's not either or, like it's Jesus and prayer, Jesus and
Mhm.
therapy, like it's both of
Mhm.
those things for him, right? And I feel like in disability studies, there's such a rejection of religion and spirituality because of the way that it's been used harmfully, because of the way people have left spiritual communities because of these kinds of sentiments.
Right.
And yet we have this like archival evidence. I have this interview with someone that is a religious Black disabled person and feels like spirituality and religion is central to the way that they experience the world and live with their disability. And that is not my personal experience, but it's in there and it's
Mhm.
clearly really important for folks. So there's not quite enough for me to like make a statement of like, here's how Black disabled people deal with religion. But there's
Right.
enough in there for me to say this is important. And it is in all of their work to talk about spirituality in relationship to healing and wellness, that it is a thing that I think is worth exploring more. And I'm really hoping that some folks who are more strongly based in spirituality and faith and religious studies can explore this in a way that isn't just about the way that folks have been harmed by religion, but the way that
Mhm.
people's religious and spiritual practices as Black disabled people have been helpful, because there's evidence that exists too. And I think it's important. Um, yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah, and I appreciate right, this reflective response, because I think again it gives opening for other people to build upon the work that you're doing and have done, but also making space for people with different kind of perspectives to come in and say that there's room for you, right? So it's a calling in um, that I think is so powerful about doing this kind of work that is informed by a feminist practice, by a Black feminist ethos, right? That there's room at the table for all. So we have a question Last question in the chat asks if there are any gems that you had to cut out of the book manuscript that you'd like to share with us.
Oh, things that I had to cut out. Huh. It's been so long, and the pandemic has really done a number on my brain. Trying to think if there's something that I cut that was like really great. I mean, I thought that the Plain Talk program was super interesting. It's this it's a conversation series between Black women and daughters, sometimes also granddaughters, auntie, adult Black women, younger Black women, having these frank conversations about sex and sexuality. And there's like this instructional video that they show first that's like a recording of one of these things, and they would show that, and then they would have these. And so it had nothing to do with disability, so it really didn't fit into the book at all. But I found it so fascinating. I think just because I could never imagine having a frank conversation about sex and sexuality with my mother. And so watching these conversations, like I watched the video in the archive, which also I love watching, like, they had to like roll them. I just found it really fascinating. I thought it was such just really important work that they were teenage girls, having these conversations, asking questions, hearing their mothers and other adult women talk about their experiences. It's just a really powerful program that they did that did not fit within the book. But if other people want to talk about like Black women's sexuality, the Plain Talk program is really cool. And I think y'all should check it out.
Thank you for that. Well, if there are no other questions, I will use my moderator prerogative to thank you all for coming out this evening and sharing time and space and conversation with Professor Sami Schalk. Also to thank my co-organizers, the African American Studies program, the Program in Disability Studies, Gender Justice Initiative, and of course my program, the Women in Gender Studies program, for hosting this. Thank you to Professor Schalk. We have found this such a generative space, listening to you, engaging with you, and also just giving us some marching orders for some new possible research projects that hopefully those on this call
Please
will,
join me. I just want more people to do Black
work.
disability studies. Come join me.
Yes, all the things. So thank you all so much. And we hope to see you for other programs in the near future as we celebrate Women's History Month. Thank you again. Bye, everyone.
Bye.